Hello from the underground. Let us turn to page 79 of Marion Crawford's translation of Balzac's Old Goriot. "Sir," said the servant, "Madame is in her boudoir and very busy. She did not answer me, but if you will go into the drawing room, sir, there is already someone there." Wondering at the terrible power possessed by servants, who with a single word can accuse or condemn their masters, Rastignac deliberately opened the door by which the footman had come in, thinking, no doubt, to impress these insolent lackeys by his familiarity with the house, but he blundered very clumsily into a small room full of lamps and dressers and pipes for warming bath towels, which led to a dark passage and a back staircase. Stifled laughter behind him in the anteroom completed his discomfiture. "This is the way to the drawing room, sir," said the footman, with an insincere show of respect which seems an added mockery. Eugene turned and traced his steps with such precipitation that he stumbled against the bathtub, but fortunately managed to hold on to his hat and saved it from immersion. At this moment, a door opened at the end of a long passage, which was lighted by a little lamp. At the same time, Eugene heard Madame de Restaud's voice, the voice of Goriot, and the sound of a kiss. He returned to the dining room, crossed it, following the footman, and entered a reception room. There he went immediately to the window, when he noticed that it looked out into the court, for he was anxious to see if this old Goriot was really his old Goriot. His heart beat strangely. He remembered Vautrin's appalling reflections. The footman was waiting for Eugene at the door of the great drawing room. Then, suddenly, an elegant young man sprang through it and said impatiently, "I'm going, Maurice. Tell Madame la Comtesse that I waited more than half an hour for her." This insolent young man, who, no doubt, had the right to dispense with the ceremony, was humming an Italian roulade as he walked towards the window where Eugene stood, in order to see the student's face as well as to look into the court. "But Monsieur le Comte would be better advised to wait a moment longer. Madame has finished," said Maurice, as he withdrew into the anteroom. Just then, old Goriot appeared through the door that opened from the little staircase into the court, near the carriage entrance. The old fellow was carrying his umbrella and preparing to open it, not noticing that the great door had been opened to allow a tilbury driven by a young man wearing a ribbon of decoration to enter. Old Goriot had barely time to throw himself backwards to avoid being run over. The spread of silk had frightened the horse, and it shied before dashing forward towards the steps. The young man turned his head angrily, looked at old Goriot, and before jumping out, bowed to him with a constrained courtesy shown to money-lenders when their services are needed, or the conventional show of respect, to be blushed for later, exacted by a man with a tarnished reputation. Old Goriot replied with a good-natured wave of his hand, full of friendliness. These events followed one another at lightning speed, and Eugene was too absorbed in watching them to notice that he was not alone. Suddenly, he heard the Countess's voice. "Oh, Maxime! Oh, Maxime! Oh, Maxime! Were you going away?" she said in a reproachful voice, which had a note of resentment in it, too. The Comtesse had not noticed the arrival of the tilbury. Rastignac turned around abruptly and saw her. She was coquettishly dressed in a fine white woolen wrap with knots of rose-colored ribbon. Her hair was carelessly done up in a Parisian woman wear it in the morning. Her perfume filled the air. She had probably just come from a bath, and her beauty seemed, as it were, softer and more voluptuous. Her eyes had a liquid brilliance. Young men's eyes see everything. Their spirit reacts to the charm a woman radiates, just as plants breathe in the substances they need from the air. So Eugene did not need to touch this woman's hands to feel their freshness. He saw the rosy hue of her skin gleaming through the thin stuff of her gown, and his eyes lingered on the folds which sometimes fell softly open to reveal her bare throat. The Countess had no need for the aid afforded by a corset. Only the belt of her wrap defined her slender waist. Her neck was an invitation to love. Her feet were pretty in their slippers. When Maxime took her hand to kiss it, Eugene's eyes fell on Maxime, and the Countess's on Eugene. "Oh, it is you, Monsieur de Regnezat. I am delighted to see you," she said, with an air of one accustomed to command, which men in precipitation obey. Maxime looked from Eugene to the Countess in a way which clearly indicated his opinion that this intruder should take his departure without more ado. "Now then, my dear, I hope you are going to do me the favor of sending this odd little creature about his business." This was the plain and obvious meaning of that proud and insolent young man whom the Countess had called Maxime, and whose face she was now studying with a submissive expression of her own that tells all a woman's secrets without her suspecting it. Rastignac felt a violent hatred of this young man rise within him. To begin with, Maxime's trim, fair, well-curled hair showed him how horrible he was. Then Maxime's boots were of fine leather and clean, while his, in spite of his care with which he had walked, were stained with faint marks of mud. And then Maxime wore an overcoat which fit him exquisitely and made him look like a pretty woman, while at 2:30 in the afternoon Eugene was wearing a black coat. The thin-skinned child of a Charente keenly felt the disadvantage at which he was placed beside this tall, slender dandy, with a pale face and clear eyes. This obvious trifler, with the affections of unprotected girls. Without waiting for an answer from Eugene, Madame de Restaud flitted rapidly into the other drawing-room, the skirts of her long gown floating and fluttering behind her, and making her look like a butterfly. And Maxime followed her. Eugene, furious, followed Maxime and the Countess, so that these three people found themselves together again, besides the fireplace in the middle of the long drawing-room. The student was perfectly well aware that he was going to annoy the detestable Maxime, but even at the risk of displeasing Madame de Restaud, that was what he wanted to do. Suddenly, as he was remembering having seen this young man at Madame de Basson's ball, he guessed the relation at which Maxime stood to Madame de Restaud, and with that youthful audacity which, if it does not blunder sensationally, is sensationally successful, he said to himself, "That man is my rival. I'll settle this hash." Reckless fellow! He did not know that it was Count Maxime de Trailer's habit to provoke an insult, draw first, and kill his man. Nor had Eugene, clever sportsman and fine shot though he was, yet bought down 20 clay pigeons out of 22. The young Count threw himself into a low chair by the fireside, took up the tongs, and poked the fire so violently and ill-tempered that a vexed look crossed Anastasie's pretty face. The young woman turned to Eugene and gave him one of those coldly interrogative stares which say so clearly, "Why don't you go?" That well-bred people immediately find themselves uttering those farewell phrases which ought to be called exit platitudes. Eugene assumed his pleasantest expression and said, "Madame, I was anxious to see you as soon as possible to—" He stopped short. A door opened. The gentleman who had driven the tilbury suddenly appeared, hatless. He refrained from greeting the Countess, looked attentively at Eugene, and held out his hand to Maxime, saying, "How do you do?" in a cordial way that oddly surprised Eugene. Young men from the provinces know nothing of how pleasant life can be in a partnership of three. "Monsieur de Restaud," said the Countess to the student, with a wave of her hand towards her husband. Eugene made a profound bow. "This gentleman," she went on, presenting Eugene to the Count de Restaud, "is Monsieur de Regnezat. He is related to Madame la Vicomtesse de Bassons through the Marseillais. I had the pleasure of meeting him at the Madame de Bassons' last ball." "Related to Madame la Vicomtesse de Bassons through the Marseillais." These words, on which the Countess laid the slightest possible emphasis with a hostess' pride in proving that she receives only people of distinction, had a magical effect. The Count's coldly formal manner relaxed, and he returned the student's bow. "Delighted to have the opportunity of making your acquaintance," he said. Count Maxime de Trélez himself cast an uneasy glance at Eugene, and suddenly dropped his insolent attitude. This transformation, in which a name had played the part of a magician's wand, unlocked 30 pigeonholes in the southerner's brain, and gave him back the wit he had stored inside him. A sudden light pierced the murky atmosphere of aristocratic Parisian society, and he could see, though still dimly. The Maison 𝐎𝐥𝐿𝐵 were at this moment very far from his thoughts. "I thought the Marsellacs were extinct," said the Count de Restaud, addressing Eugene. "They are," answered the law student. "My great-uncle, the Chevalier de Regnestan, married the heiress of the Marsellac family. He had only 2 daughters, who married the Maréchal de Clarimbault, grandfather of Madame de Besson, through her mother. We are the younger branch of the family, and even poorer than we should otherwise have been, since my great-uncle, the vice-admiral, lost all he had in the king's service. The government during the Revolution refused to admit our claims when the Compagnie des Indes were liquidated." "Hadn't your great-granduncle command of the Vanqueur before 1789? "He did." "Then he must have known my grandfather, who was in the command of the Warwick." Maxime slightly shrugged his shoulders and looked at Madame de Restaud with an expression which said plainer than words, "If he begins to talk naval shop with that old fellow, heaven help us." Anastasia understood him. With a woman's admirable command of the situation, she smilingly said, "Come, Maxine, I have something to ask you. We will leave you 2 gentlemen to convoy with each other in the Warwick and the Vanqueur." She rose and made a mock conspiratorial sign to Maxime, who followed her toward the boudoir. The morganatic couple, to use a convenient German word, which has no exact equivalent in our language, had barely reached the door when the Comte interrupted his conversation with Eugene. "Anastasie, stay here, my dear," he called out peevishly. "You know very well that—" "I won't be long," she interrupted him. "I need just a moment to tell Maxime what I want him to do for me." She returned very soon. All women obliged to study their husband's character in order that they themselves may do as they like, quickly learn just how far they may go without endangering the trust they prize, and they never cross their husband in the little things of life. The Countess had seen by the Count's tone that it would not be safe to remain in the boudoir. Eugene was the cause of this unpleasantness, and the Countess expressed her feelings to Maxine with a glance at the student and a gesture of vexation. Maxine said very tersely to the other 3, "Well, you are busy. I won't bother you. Goodbye." And he strode away. "Wait, Maxime," cried the Count. "Come to dinner," said the Countess, once more deserting the Count and Eugene and following Maxime to the first drawing-room, where they remained together long enough to make it seem likely that in the interval the student had taken his leave. Rastignac could hear them shouting with laughter and talking with intervals when they fell silent, but the student maliciously exerted himself to entertain Monsieur de Restaud, flattering him and drawing him into the discussion, for he had made up his mind to see the Countess again and find out what the relationship was between her and old Goriot. This woman was a complete mystery to him. Clearly in love with Maxine, yet she ruled her husband, and was tied by some secret bond to the old tradesman. He longed to penetrate the mystery, and so, as he hoped, gain sovereign power over this typical Parisian. "Anastasie," called the Count again. "Come, my poor dear Maxine," she said to the young man, "we must resign ourselves. This evening, I hope, Nasie," he whispered in her ear, "that you will keep the door closed to this little fellow. His eyes glowed like coals when he looked at you just now. He will declare his passion for you, and compromise you, and you will force me to kill him." "Are you mad, Maxine?" said she. "Don't you realize that these little students, far from being dangerous, are excellent lightning conductors?"
I'll make Rousseau wildly jealous of him, believe me." Maxime burst out laughing and went out, followed by the Countess, who stood at the window to watch him as he jumped into his carriage and set the horse prancing with a flourish of his whip. She returned only when the great door closed behind him. "Just listen to this, my dear," cried the Count when she came in. "This gentleman's family estate is not far from Vertueux on the Chantine. His great-uncle and my grandfather were acquainted." "Charmed to have acquaintances in common," said the Countess absent-mindedly. "More than you think," said Eugene in a low voice. "What do you mean?" she said quickly. "Just now," the student went on, "I saw a gentleman leave our house who lives next door to me in the same boarding-house, old 𝐎𝐥𝐝." At this name, embellished with the word old, the Count, who was mending the fire, threw the tongs into as if they burned his fingers, and stood up. "Sir, you might have said Monsieur 𝐎𝐥𝐝," he exclaimed. The Countess at first turned pale as she saw her husband's annoyance. Then he blushed and showed obvious embarrassment. She replied in a voice she tried to make natural, with an assumption of rather unreal ease. "You could not be acquainted with anyone we are fonder of." She stopped short, looked at her piano as if some sudden whim had seized her, and said, "Do you like music?" "Very much," replied Eugene, red-faced and abashed by the crass social blunder he confusedly felt he had somehow committed. "Do you sing?" she cried, going to her piano and vigorously executing a run from one end of the keyboard. "No, madame." The Count de Ristal paced up and down the room. "Ah, that's a pity. It deprives you of an easy means of making your way. Caro, 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 non bidutare," sang the Countess. In pronouncing old 𝐎𝐥𝐝's name, Eugene had waved a magic wand again, but the effect was quite different from that he had produced with the words related to Madame de Beauseant. He found himself in the plight of a man introduced as a favor into a house of a collector of curios, who clumsily blundered against a showcase full of statuettes and knocked off 3 or 4 badly joined heads. He wished the world would open and swallow him. Madame de Ristal's voice looked reserved and cold, and her indifferent glance avoided the eyes of the hapless student. "Madame," he said, "you have things to discuss with Monsieur de Ristal, so with your permission, any time you come," said the Countess hastily, stopping Eugene with a gesture, "you may be sure that Monsieur de Ristal and I shall be delighted to see you." Eugene made a profound bow to the Countess and to the Count and went out, followed by Monsieur de Ristal, who insisted, in spite of his protest, on accompanying him to the anteroom. "Whenever that gentleman calls," said the Count to Maurice, "Madame is not at home, nor am I." As Eugene set foot on the steps, he saw that it was raining. "Well," he said to himself, "I've just made a mess of things, and I don't know how, or how much damage I have done, and now I'm going to ruin my hat and coat into the bargain. What I should do is sit in the corner and swat up law, and not look to be anything better than a boorish country magistrate. How can I go into society when to do the thing decently you have to have stacks of cabs and polished boots and all sorts of things, gold chains and white doe-skin gloves that cost 6 francs in the morning, and yellow gloves every evening? To blazes with you, old 𝐎𝐥𝐝, you old scamp." When he reached the street door, the driver of a hackney coach, who had obviously just set down a newly married couple, and who asked nothing better than to pick up some illicit fares in his master's time, seeing Eugene without an umbrella and dressed in black and white waistcoat, yellow gloves, and polished boots, hailed the student. Eugene was in the grip of one of those blind rages that drives a young man to plunge deeper into the abyss he has entered, as if to find a happy issue there. With less than 23 sous in his pocket, he nodded assent to the driver and stepped into the carriage, where some orange blossom petals and silver thread bore witness to its previous occupants by bride and groom. "Where to, sir?" said the driver, who had already taken off his white gloves. "The devil take it," said Eugene to himself. Since I'm going the pace, I must at least get value for my money. "Drive to the Hotel des Bessons," he added aloud. "Which?" said the driver. This lofty question shook Eugene's composure. The unfledged dandy was not aware that there were 2 Hotels des Bessons. He did not know how rich he was in relations who did not care 2 straws about him. "The Comtesse de Bessons, Rue de Grenelle," interrupted the driver, nodding his head. "You see," he added as he pulled up the step, "there's the Count's house and the Marquis in the Rue Saint-Dominique." "Yes, of course," replied Eugene dryly. "Must everybody jeer at me today?" he said to himself, throwing his head on the cushion in front of him. Here's a game that's going to cost me a king's ransom. But at least I'll call on my so-called cousin in solidly aristocratic style. Old Goriot has already cost me at least 10 francs, that old scoundrel. Upon my word, I think I'll tell Madame de Bessons my adventure and make her laugh. She is sure to know the secret of the scandalous bond between the tailless old rat and the beautiful woman. It's better for me to make myself agreeable to my cousin than to risk being rebuffed by this shameless woman, who strikes me anyhow as having very expensive taste. If the mere name of this fair Vicomtesse is so powerful, what could she herself not do for me? We must fly high. When you challenge heaven, you must needs aim at God." These words briefly summarized the thought, and These words briefly summarized the 1,001 thoughts which soared through his mind. He regained something of his coolness and self-confidence as he watched the rain falling. He told himself that though he were about to squander 2 of his last precious 5-franc pieces, the money was well spent in protecting his coat, boots, and hat. He could not help feeling exultant when he heard the coachman shouting, "Gate, if you please." The porter in red and gold made the great gate groan on its hinges, and it was with a sweet satisfaction that Eugene saw his carriage pass under the arch, turn round the court, and draw up under the porch before the steps. The coachman, in his voluminous blue greatcoat bordered with red, came to let down the step. As Eugene was getting out of the cab, he heard smothered laughter from under the peristyle. 3 or 4 lackeys had been cracking jokes at the expenses of this plebeian's bride's turnout. A moment later, the student knew in a flash what they were making merry over, as he compared his carriage with one of the most elegant bohèmes in Paris. Its high-spirited horses had roses at their ears, they champed the bit, and a powdered, cravated coachman held them in check, as if they were ready to dash off if he did not. And at the Chaussée d'Antin, Madame de Bristol had the smart cabriolet of a young man of 26 in her court. At the Faubourg Saint-Germain, a carriage which 30,000 francs could not have bought waited the pleasure of a great nobleman. Who can be here? Eugene wondered, realizing a little late in the day that there must be very few women to be met with in Paris whose affections were not already engaged, and that the conquest of one of these queens cost more than blue blood. Confound it all. My cousin probably has her Maxime too. He walked up the steps with death in his heart. As he approached, the glass door was opened, and he saw a number of footmen, all looking as grave as judges. The party he had attended had been held in the large reception rooms on the ground floor of the Hotel des Bessons, and as he had not had time between the invitation and the ball to call on his cousin, he had not yet visited Madame de Besson's own apartment, so he was now going to see her for the first time. The wonders of the exquisite surroundings through which a woman of distinction expresses her own individual elegance, which reveal her soul and reflect her mode of living. His scrutiny of them was even more curious than it otherwise would have been, since Madame de Restaud's drawing-room furnished him with a standard of comparison. At 4:30, the Viscountess might be seen. 5 minutes earlier, she would not have received her cousin. Eugene, who knew nothing of the various nice points in Parisian etiquette, was ushered towards Madame de Persoon's apartment along a red carpet, up a great white staircase with gilt banisters and decorations of massed flowers. He was completely ignorant of her story, one of those biographical tales which are related by one friend to another, with additions and alterations every evening in all the drawing-rooms of Paris. For the last 3 years, the Viscountess had had a connection with one of the richest and most distinguished noblemen of Portugal, the Marquis de 𝐎𝐥𝐵. He was one of those innocent friendships which are so absorbing to the persons concerned that they cannot endure the presence of a third party. The Vicomte de Beausset had accordingly himself set an example to the public by respecting, whether willingly or no, this morganatic union. In the early days of the friendship, anyone who came to see the Viscountess at 2 o'clock found the Marquis de 𝐎𝐥𝐵 there. Madame de Beausset was obliged to receive these visitors, and she could not very well shut her door against them, but she received them so coldly, and sat studying the ceiling so earnestly, that every visitor understood how much he bored her. When it became known in Paris that callers between 2 and 4 bored Madame de Beausset, she found herself left in the most complete solitude for those 2 hours. She went to the Bouffons, or to the opera, escorted by both Monsieur de Beausset and Monsieur de 𝐎𝐥𝐵. Excuse me. But, as a well-bred man of the world, Monsieur de Beausset always left his wife and the Portuguese when he had installed them in their seats. When Monsieur de 𝐎𝐥𝐵 thought it was his duty to marry, and was preparing for his wedding with a Mademoiselle de Rochefide, that's a cool last name, Mademoiselle de Rochefide. In the whole fashionable world, only one person still knew nothing of the projected marriage, and that was Madame de Beausset. A few of her friends had spoken of it to her in vague terms. She had laughed at them, believing that her friends wished to cloud a happiness that they were envious of. The banns were about to be published, however. Although the handsome Portuguese had come this afternoon with the express purpose of telling the Vicomtesse about the marriage, he had not dared to breathe a word of his treachery. His hesitation is easy to explain, for there is indeed nothing harder than to deliver such an ultimatum to a woman. Some men find themselves more at ease on the dueling grounds, faced by a man who holds a sword point against their heart, than they are when a woman, after a 2-hour spell of lamentation, swears she is dying and calls for smelling salts. At this moment, then, Monsieur de 𝐎𝐥𝐵 was on thorns and longed to take his leave, telling himself that Madame de Beausset would hear the news. He would write to her. It would be better to deal this death blow to her heart by letter than by word of mouth. When the lackey announced Monsieur Eugene de Rastignac, the Marquis de 𝐎𝐥𝐵 gave a start of joy. It is worthy of note that a woman in love raises doubts for herself with even more ingenuity than she uses in seeking fresh forms of happiness. When she is on the point of being forsaken, she leaps to the meaning of a gesture with greater swiftness than Virgil's courser scents the distant traces which speak to him of his mate. And so, of course, Madame de Besson, surprised that involuntary start, slight but terrifying in its ineffective frankness. Eugene did not know that in Paris one should never present oneself at anyone's house without previously learning from friends or family the whole history of husband, wife, children, in order to avoid committing one of the blunders in regard to which they say picturesquely in Poland, "Yoke 5 oxen to your cart," probably because you will need them to pull you out of the quagmire into which your false step has plunged you. If these conversational misadventures are still without a name in France, it must be that they are thought to be impossible there because of the enormous publicity given the scandals. No one but Eugene, after having bogged himself in the drawing-room of Madame de Restaud, had not even given him time to yoke the 5 oxen to his cart, could have continued his floundering course by appearing in Madame de Besson's drawing-room, but if Madame de Restaud and Monsieur de Tralles had found him horribly in that way, Monsieur de 𝐎𝐥𝐿 was very pleased to see him. "Goodbye," said the Portuguese, hurrying to the door as Eugene entered a dainty little grey and pink drawing-room where luxury seems another name for elegance. "But just till this evening," said Madame de Besson, turning her head and looking at the Marquis. "We are going to the Buffons, are we not?" "I can't go," he said with his finger on the door-handle. Madame de Besson rose and called him to her, without paying the least attention to Eugene, who was standing dazzled by the splendor of this fairy-tale surroundings, half believing the stories of the Arabian Nights were true, and not knowing where to hide his head if he found himself in the presence of this woman who took no notice of him whatever. The Viscountess had beckoned the Marquis with a graceful movement of her right hand and pointed to a seat in front of her. The gesture expressed so imperiously the strong compulsion of passion that the Marquis let go of the door-handle and came. Eugene watched him, not without envy. "So, that's the man with the bohème," he said to himself. "But you have to have prancing horses, servants in livery, and oceans of money to catch a glance from a Parisian woman. Desire to have the power to make an ostentatious show gnawed like a demon at his heart. Greed burned in him like a fever. Thirst for the gold dried up his throat. He had 130 francs to spend every quarter. His father, mother, brothers, sisters, aunt did not spend more than 200 francs a month among them. This rapid comparison between his present situation and the goal ambition set before him completed his confusion. "And why can you not come to the Italians?" said the Viscountess, laughing, to the Portuguese. "Business. I am dining with the English ambassador. Throw him over." When a man starts to deceive, he is inevitably compelled to pile lie upon lie. Monsieur de 𝐎𝐥𝐿 therefore said with a laugh, "You command me?" "I do indeed." "That was what I wanted to hear you say," he replied with a fond look that would have reassured any other woman. He took the Viscountess's hand, kissed it, and went. Eugene passed his hand over his hair and wriggled, preparing to bow, supposing that Madame de Besson was about to recognize his existence. Suddenly she sprang up, rushing to the gallery, ran to the window there, and watched Monsieur de 𝐎𝐥𝐿 step into his carriage. She listened to the order, and heard the porter repeat to the coachman, "To Monsieur de Roquefid's house." These words, and the way Monsieur 𝐎𝐿 dived hurriedly into his carriage, were like a thunderbolt and a flash of illumination to this woman, who turned back, devoured by deadly apprehensions. The most horrible catastrophes are not worse than those in the world of fashion, The Viscountess went into her room, sat down, and took some dainty notepaper. When you dine with the Rockefides instead of at an English embassy, you owe me an explanation, and I am waiting for it. She corrected several letters of her handwriting, shaken by the trembling of her hand, signed C for Claire de Bourgogne, and rang. "Jacques," she said to the servant who appeared at once, "go at 7:30 to Monsieur de Roquefid's house, and ask for the Marquis de 𝐎𝐥𝐵. If the Marquis is there, send in this letter without waiting for an answer. If he is not there, bring the note back to me." "Madame la Vicomtesse has someone waiting in her drawing-room." "Oh, yes, of course," she said, opening the door. Eugene was beginning to feel very uncomfortable when at last he saw the Viscountess appear. She said to him in a tone whose pathos tugged at his heartstrings, "I begged your pardon, monsieur. I had to write a note. I am now entirely at your service." She hardly knew what she was saying, for as she spoke, she was thinking, "Ha! He means to marry Mademoiselle de Roquefide. But does he imagine he is free? This very evening that marriage shall be broken off, or But there will be no more question of it tomorrow." "Cousin," replied Eugene. "What?" exclaimed the Viscountess, with a look whose haughtiness froze Eugene. He understood this. What? In the last 3 hours he had learned a great deal, and he was on his guard. "Madame," he said again, blushing. He hesitated, and then continued, "Forgive me. I need your favor so badly that a scrap of a relationship would have done no harm." Madame de Besson smiled, but sadly. She felt misfortune in the air around her, growing and rumbling like an approaching storm. "If you knew the situation my family is placed in," he went on, "you would love to play the role of a fairy godmother who delights to scatter the obstacles that lie in her godchild's path." "Well, cousin," she said, laughing, "what can I do for you?" "But I can't tell even that. To be connected with you, even by a tie of kinship so slight that it is lost in obscurity, is a whole fortune in itself. You have set my brain in a whirl, and I don't know now what I was going to say to you. I know no one else but you and Perry. If I could only ask you to be my counselor, beg you to accept me as a poor child who wants to tie himself to your apron strings, and who would gladly die for you." "Would you kill a man for me?" "2, asserted Eugene. "Child. Yes, you are a child," she said, holding back her tears. "You at least would love sincerely." "Oh," he said, nodding his head. The audacity of the student's answer had aroused the Vicomtesse's keenest interest. The Southerner had begun for the first time to calculate the effect of his words. Between Madame de Ristaud's blue boudoir and the pink drawing-room of the Madame de Besson, he had made 3 years' advances in the Prussian law, which is never mentioned, although it constitutes a higher social jurisprudence, which, well learned and carefully practiced, is a high road to success. "Ah, this is what I was going to say," said Eugene. "I met Madame de Ristaud at your ball. This morning I went to call on her." "You must have been very much in her way," said Madame de Besson, smiling. "Oh, yes. I am an ignoramus who will set everyone against him if you refuse your help. I imagined that in Paris it is very difficult to meet an unappropriated woman who is young, rich, beautiful, and elegant, and I am in dire need of someone who will teach me what you women can expound so well. Life. I shall find a Monsieur de Tralles everywhere. So I came to you to ask you for the answer to a riddle, to beg you to tell me what kind of blunder I made. I spoke of an old Madame la Duchesse de Langeais, answered Jacques, breaking in on the student, who made a gesture of intense annoyance. If you wish to be successful, said the Viscountess in a low voice, you must first learn not to show your feelings so unrestrainedly. Good afternoon, my dear, she exclaimed, rising and going to meet the Duchess and pressing her hand with a caressing effusiveness which might have shown to a sister. The Duchess responded to this with the most touching fondness. These are two good friends, said Eugene to himself. From now on, I shall have two protectresses. These two women must feel a partiality for each other's friend, and this one will surely take an interest in me too. What happy inspiration gives me the pleasure of seeing you, my dear Antoinette, said Madame de Berson. Oh, I saw Monsieur 𝐎𝐥𝐝 going to the Monsieur de Roquefaide's house, so I thought I should find you alone. Madame de Berson did not compress her lips, did not blush. Her steady gaze did not falter. Her forehead seemed to grow smoother as the Duchess uttered these deadly words. If I had known that you were engaged, added the Duchess, turning to Eugene. This gentleman is Monsieur Eugene de Restan, one of my cousins, said the Viscountess. Have you any news of General de Montreville? She asked. Secrecy told me yesterday that no one sees anything of him nowadays. Did he call on you today? The Duchess, who was said to have been forsaken by Monsieur de Montreville, with whom she was madly in love, was pierced to the heart by the barbed question, and she blushed as she replied, He was at the Ulysses yesterday. On duty? Asked Madame de Berson. Clara, I suppose you know, said the Duchess, looking at her in bitter hatred, that the banns of Monsieur de 𝐎𝐥𝐝 and Mademoiselle de Rochefide are to be published tomorrow. This blow was too violent. The Viscountess turned pale as she answered with a laugh. That's one of the rumors that foolish people waste their time over. Why should Monsieur de 𝐎𝐥𝐝 bestow one of the noblest names in Portugal to the Roquefides? The Roquefides are upstarts, ennobled yesterday. But they say that Bertha will have 200,000 livres a year. Monsieur de 𝐎𝐥𝐝 is too rich to be a fortune hunter. But, my dear, Mademoiselle de Rochefide is a charming girl. Ah! Anyhow, he is dining there today. The arrangements have been concluded. I am very much surprised you should know so little about it. What was the blunder you made, monsieur? Said Madame de Berson. This poor child is so newly launched into the world, my dear Antoinette, that he doesn't understand in the least what we're talking about. Have mercy on him, and let us put off our discussion of this until tomorrow. Tomorrow, things will be official, I presume, and your information that you have so kindly shared with me confirmed. The Duchess turned to Eugene. The Duchess turned on Eugene the kind of insolent stares that looks a man over from head to toe, flattens him out, and leaves him feeling like a worm. I have plunged a dagger unwittingly into Madame de Restaud's heart, madame, unwittingly. That was my crime, said the student, whose keen wits had served him well enough. He had recognized the biting sarcasm concealed in these remarks, apparently so affectionate. You continue to receive, and perhaps you even fear, People who understand how much they are hurting you, while a person who wounds and does not know how deeply is looked on as a fool, a clumsy fellow who cannot use his opportunities, and everyone despises him. Madame de Besson bestowed a soft look on the student, one of those looks in which a great soul can combine gratitude with dignity. This look was balm to the wound inflicted on the student's self-esteem by the way in which the Duchess had summed him up with the appraising stare of a bailiff's valuer. And would you believe that I had just captured the goodwill of the Comte de Restaud? For I should tell you, madame, he said, turning to the Duchess with an air both humble and malicious, I am only a poor devil of a student, very much alone, very poor. Don't say that, Monsieur de Restaud. We women never want to say... Don't say that, Monsieur de Rastignac. We women never want a thing that no one else wants. Ugh, said Eugene. I am only 22. I have put up with the disadvantages of my life, of the time of my life. Moreover, I'm at confession, and it would be impossible to kneel in a prettier confessional. It's a place for committing the sins one confesses elsewhere. The Duchess's expression grew chilly as she listened to this flippant speech, and she rebuked its bad taste by turning to the Viscountess and beginning, This gentleman has only just come. Madame de Besson began to laugh unaffectedly at her cousin and the Duchess. He has only just come, my dear, and is looking for a teacher to give him a lesson in good taste. Madame la Duchesse, said Eugene, it is not natural to desire to find out the secret of what charms us. Come, he said to himself, I'm sure these are very pretty turned phrases. But I believe Madame de Restaud is herself a pupil of Monsieur de Trellis, said the Duchess. I knew nothing whatever about it, madame, said the student, so I threw myself between them like a blind fool. However, I had reached a fairly good understanding with the husband, and found myself tolerated for a time at least by the wife, when I took it into my head to tell them that I knew a man whom I had just seen leaving by a back staircase, and who had kissed the Countess in the shadows of a passage. Who was it? Said the women simultaneously. An old man who lives for 2 louis a month at the bottom of the Faubourg Saint-Monsieur, as I, a poor student, do. A poor wretch whom everyone laughs at, and whom we call Old Goriot. But, child that you are, cried the Viscountess, Madame de Restaud was a Mademoiselle Goriot, the daughter of a vermicelli maker, added the Duchess, a little woman who was presented at court the same day as a pastry cook's daughter. Don't you remember, Clara? The king began to laugh, and made a joke in Latin about flour. What was it? People ejusdin farina, said Eugene. That was it, said the Duchess. Oh, is he her father? Said the student, horror-stricken. Yes, indeed. The worthy man has 2 daughters whom he is half mad about, although they have virtually cast him off. Didn't the second marry a banker with a German name, a Baron de Nucingen? A Baron de Nucingen, said the Viscountess, looking at Madame de Langeais. Her name is Delphine, isn't it? She's a blonde, and she owns a side box at the opera, and goes to the Baufuns, too, and laughs very loudly in order to attract attention. Isn't that the other daughter? The Duchess smiled and said, Really, my dear, I wonder at you. Why should you concern yourself so much about people of that kind? One would have to be infatuated, as Ristal is, to have anything to do with Mademoiselle Anastasie and her flour sacks. Oh, we won't gain much by that bargain. She is in the hands of Monsieur de Trelles, and he'll ruin her. They have cast off their father, Eugene repeated. Yes, indeed, their own father, replied the Viscountess. The father, a good father, who, they say, gave each of them 500,000 or 600,000 francs to ensure their happiness by marrying them well, and kept only 8,000 or 10,000 livres a year for himself, believing that his daughters would remain his daughters. And in their new lives he had created 2 new existences for himself, gained 2 houses where he would be made much of and adored. Within 2 years his sons-in-laws had banished him from their company as if he was the lowest social outcast. Tears sprang to Eugene's eyes. He had recently been exposed to the pure and holy influences of family affections. He was still held by the spell of youthful beliefs, and this was only his first day on the battlefield of Parisian civilization. True emotion is so infectious that for a moment these 3 persons looked at one another in silence. Ah, yes, indeed, said Madame de Langeais. It seems very terrible, and yet we see it every day. Is there a reason for that? Tell me, my dear, have you ever considered what a son-in-law is? A son-in-law is a man for whom we shall rear, you and I, a dear little creature to whom affections bind us with 1,000 ties, and will be the joy of her family for 17 years. Its white soul, as Lamartine would say, but is destined to become its torment. When this man takes her from us, he will begin by using her love for him as an axe to cut out, root and branch, from the living heart of this angel all the feelings which bound her to her family. Yesterday our daughter was all ours, and we were all hers. Tomorrow she has changed into an enemy. Do we not see this tragedy enacted every year? Here a daughter-in-law is unspeakably rude to her father-in-law, who has sacrificed everything for his son. There is a son-in-law turns his wife's mother from his door. I hear people asking if anything dramatic ever happens in society nowadays, but the drama of the son-in-law is appalling, to say nothing of our marriages, which have become very sorry farces. I understand quite well what happened to the old vermicelli maker. I believe I recollect that this Goriot, madame, yes, this Moriot was president of his section during the Revolution. He was in the know about the notorious famine, and laid the foundation of his fortune at that time by selling flour for 10 times as much as it cost him. He made as much flour as he wanted. My grandmother's land steward sold him enormous quantities. This Noriot, no doubt, shared the loot, as persons of his kind always did, with the Committee for Public Welfare. I remember that this land steward told my grandfather that she could remain. Goddamn. I remember that this land steward told my grandmother that she could remain in perfect safety at Grandvillers, because her grain was an excellent certificate of civic merit. Well, this Loriot, who sold corn to the cutthroats, had only one passion, so they say. He adored his daughters. He gave the elder a roosting place under the de Restout roof, and grafted the other on the Baron de Nucingen, a rich banker who set up for the Royalists. You can quite understand that so long as Bonaparte was emperor, the 2 sons-in-laws did not much mind having the old 93 man in their house. But when the Bourbons were restored, it was a different story. The old fellow was in Monsieur de Restaud's way, and even more tiresomely in the banker's. The daughters, who were still perhaps fond of their father, wanted to save both the gore and the cabbage, to run with the hare and the hounds, to please both father and husband. They saw the �𝐥𝐝 when they had no other visitors, and invented pretexts for doing this, which made it seem due only to affection. Papa, come to such and such a time. It will be nicer then, because we shall be alone together, and so forth. But I believe, for my part, my dear, that real feeling has eyes and intelligence. The heart of our poor 93 must have bled. He saw that his daughters were ashamed of him, and if they loved their husbands, he made trouble between them and his sons-in-laws. He was bound to sacrifice himself then. He did sacrifice himself, being a father. He made himself an exile from their homes. When he saw his daughters happy, he knew that he had done well. Father and children are accomplices in this little crime. You see the same sort of thing everywhere. What could this old 𝐿𝐥𝐝 have been but a grease stain in his daughters' drawing rooms? He would have felt awkward, and he would have been bored. What had happened to his father, what had happened to this father with his daughters might happen to the prettiest woman in Paris with the man she loves best. But if she tires him with her love, he will fly from her. He will commit the meanest actions to escape. It's the same thing with our feelings. Our heart is a treasury. If you spend all its wealth at once, you are ruined. We find it as difficult to forgive a person for displaying his feelings in all its nakedness as we do to forgive a man for being penniless. This father had given everything. Throughout 20 years, he had given his love, his whole heart. He gave his fortune in one day. When the lemon was well squeezed, his daughters left the rind in the gutter. "The world is vile," said the Viscountess, her fingers playing with the fringe of her shawl, and her eyes downcast, for she was touched to the quick by the words of Madame de Langeais, which had aimed at her in telling the story. "Vile? No," answered the Duchess. "It goes its way, that's all. If I talk like this about it, it's only to show you that I am not taken in by the world. I think as you do," she said, pressing the Vicomtesse's hand. "The world is a slough. So let us try to stay on higher ground." She rose and kissed Madame de Bassons on the forehead. Then she said, "You are very lovely just now, my dear. I have never seen you with a prettier color in your cheeks." With a slight bow to the cousin, she took her leave. "Old 𝐿𝐥𝐝 is sublime," said Eugene as he remembered how he had watched his neighbor crushing the silver plate during the night. Madame de Bassons did not hear. She was lost in her own thoughts. Some moments passed in silence, and the poor student, in a sort of paralysis of embarrassment, dared neither to go, nor say, nor speak. "The world is vile and malicious," said the Viscountess at last. "As soon as misfortune overtakes you, there is always a friend ready to come and announce it, and probe your heart with a dagger while bidding you admire the hilt. Sarcasm and mockery already? But I will defend myself." She raised her head like the great lady she was, and lightning flashed from her proud eyes. She said, catching sight of Eugene. "You are here." "Yes, still," he said piteously. "Well, Monsieur de Rastignac, treat this world as it deserves. You want to succeed, and I will help you. You shall sound the depths of feminine corruption, measure the immensity of the miserable vanity of men. Always, Although I am well read in the books of the world, there were pages I had not turned. Now I know it all. The more cold-bloodedly you calculate, the farther you will go. Strike ruthlessly, and you will be feared. Regard men and women only as you do post horses, that you will leave worn out at every stage, and so you shall arrive at the goal of your desires. Keep in mind that you will be no one here unless you have a woman to interest herself in you. She must be young, rich, fashionable. But if you have any real feeling, hide it like a treasure. Never let it be suspected, or you will be lost. You would no longer be the executioner then, but the victim. If you ever fall in love, guard your secret well. Do not yield it up unless you are very sure you know to whom you are opening your heart. To preserve your love while it is still unborn, learn to distrust this world. Listen to me, 𝐎𝐥𝐿. She called him by this name quite naturally, without noticing her mistake. The desertion of the father by the two daughters, who wish he were dead, is hideous enough. But there is something still more hideous, the rivalry of the two sisters among themselves. 𝐕∗ is of good birth. His wife has been accepted by fashionable society. She has been presented at court. But her sister, her rich sister, the Madame Dauphine de Nucingen, the wife of the man of wealth, is ready to die of chagrin. Jealousy devours her. She and her sister are 100 leagues asunder. Her sister is her sister no longer. They have cast off each other as they have cast off their father. And so Madame de Nucingen would lap up all the mud between the Rue Saint-Lazare and the Rue des Grenelles if it enabled her to enter my drawing-room. She fancied that de Marsay would help her attain her end, and she has made herself de Marsay's slave. She plagues de Marsay. De Marsay cares very little about her. If you present her to me, you will be her Benjamin. She will adore you. Love her if you can after that. If not, then make use of her. I will have her as a guest once or twice at a large party when there is a mob, but I will never receive her here in the morning. I will bow to her when we meet. That is enough. You have closed the Countess's door against you by uttering old Goriot's name. Yes, my friend, you may go 20 times to call on Madame de Restaud, and 20 times you will find her not at home. You will not be admitted there. Well, then, let old Goriot gain you entrance to Madame Dauphine de Nucingen's house. The beautiful Madame de Nucingen shall be a banner for you. She shall make you known. If you are the man she favors, other women will dote on you. Her rivals, her friends, her best friends will want to steal you from her. There are women who love a man because it has been chosen by another, just as there are poor middle-class women who copy our hats and think by doing so acquire our manners too. You will have a success. In Paris, social success is everything. It is the key of power. If the women think you have wit and talent, the men will believe it. If you don't undeceive them. You can then set your ambition as high as you like. You can have the entry everywhere. You will find out then what the world is, an assembly of fools and knaves. Take care. Take care that you do not belong to either class. I give you my name as Ariande. I give you my name as an Ariande's clue to help you thread this labyrinth. Do not compromise it, she said, raising her chin as she spoke and casting a queenly glance at the student. Give it back to me untarnished. Go now, and leave me. We women have our own battles to fight. If you should need a man who will gladly set off a mine for you, said Eugene, interrupting her, well, he stuck his heart. smiled in answer to his cousin's smile, and went out. Brings us to page 105 of Cromwell's translation of Balzac's 𝐎𝐥𝐿. Jesus Christ.